Over the frozen skies of Europe, death could arrive without warning. One second the sun glinted off a wing, the next a curtain of flak burst open, turning the heavens into a storm of metal. In those endless formations of B-17s and B-24s, men sat inside thin aluminum shells, thousands of feet above a hostile world, trusting luck, skill, and one another to bring them home. They wore sheepskin jackets, oxygen masks, and parachutes, but none of it could stop a piece of shrapnel slicing through flesh. The U.S. Army Air Forces called it the cost of daylight precision bombing. The men who flew simply called it hell. Each mission was a gamble. Crews counted their odds in cigarettes and superstition. 13 missions meant trouble. A 4-leaf clover tucked in a glove might mean one more sunrise. The flak was merciless. But even worse were the jagged fragments that tore through the fuselage when a fighter's cannon found its mark. A single burst could turn a bomber's waist gunner into a statistic before he even realized he'd been hit. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to shield the heart and lungs that kept these crews alive. At the briefing rooms in England, flight surgeons patched up whoever came back. They watched stretchers roll in after every raid, uniforms soaked in blood, the same wounds over and over, chest and abdomen ripped open, lungs collapsed, lives ending in the thin air of 30,000 feet. Those doctors were supposed to observe, record, and maintain morale, not to invent or question equipment. Yet among them was one surgeon who refused to look away. He had seen too many men die on his table. He had written too many letters to mothers explaining that their sons had died instantly, even when he knew they hadn't. His name was Dr. Dwight H. Johnson, compact, precise, the sort of man who polished his instruments until they gleamed. Officially, he was a flight surgeon assigned to a heavy bomber group. Unofficially, he was a man losing patience with bureaucracy. Johnson kept statistics the way others kept diaries. He knew exactly how many gunners had died from chest wounds, how many could have lived if a few ounces of steel had stood between them and the shrapnel. But every request he sent up the chain came back the same. Not authorized. Protective armor was too heavy, too cumbersome. The Air Corps insisted that speed and altitude were the best defenses. To burden a crew with extra weight, they said, might cost more lives than it saved. Night after night, he sat in the makeshift medical hut, listening to engines returning from missions. When a squadron came back light by 2 or 3 planes, the silence that followed was unbearable. He'd step outside, smell the burned oil, and think about the men who weren't landing. He began sketching ideas on the backs of medical charts, patterns shaped to fit the torso, overlapping plates that could stop a fragment, but still let a man move. To the men in the mess hall, he looked obsessed. To Johnson, obsession was the only way to fight fate. The first time he mentioned his idea, the mechanics laughed. "What are we supposed to wear, Doc? Tin suits?" But a few days later, when a waist gunner named Sam Miller was brought in with a jagged wound across his ribs, Johnson didn't laugh. He saw the thin layer of fabric and leather that had failed him and thought, if it had been steel instead. So he started collecting scraps, bits of armor plate from crashed aircraft, pieces of steel cut from damaged fuselages. He weighed each one, tested their bend, his hands blistering from the cold metal. Slowly, a pattern emerged, overlapping curved sections that followed the chest, lighter at the shoulders, heavier over the heart. When he fitted the pieces together on a dummy torso, they clicked like puzzle parts. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't even legal. But it felt right. At night, the airfield trembled with engines. The sound became a heartbeat for the base, each takeoff a reminder that some of those heartbeats would stop before morning. Johnson watched from the infirmary window, the glow of exhaust flames reflected in his glasses, and promised himself he'd find a way to keep at least a few of them beating longer. He had no budget, no approval, and no blueprint, just a belief that saving one man was worth the trouble. The Army's quartermasters saw him as a nuisance. The pilots saw him as eccentric. But among the gunners and crew chiefs, whispers began to spread about the doctor with the steel vest. Some called it a death wish. Others called it hope. The whispers traveled faster than orders. Men talked about it over mess hall coffee and in the damp barracks before dawn. "Doc's making armor," someone said. Real armor like knights used to wear. Most brushed it off. A few leaned closer, curiosity edging past fear. When you were flying at 25,000 feet with no armor plate around your chest, anything that promised another chance to see home sounded worth a try. One bitter morning, Johnson carried a bundle wrapped in canvas to the hangar. Beneath the hum of generators, he laid out the pieces on a wooden table, curved plates hand-cut and riveted to heavy canvas. It looked rough, uneven, a Frankenstein's mixture of workshop metal and field medicine. But when a crew chief lifted it, surprise flickered across his face. It was lighter than it looked, 12 pounds, less than a parachute pack. Johnson slid his hands into the vest and fastened the straps. "See," he said, "you can still move. You can still shoot." He bent, twisted, raised his arms as if gripping a waist gun. The metal shifted slightly but held. The sound was a faint rasp of steel on steel, solid, reassuring. The crew chief nodded. "You really think it'll stop a 20mm cannon?" "No," Johnson said quietly, "but it'll stop everything else." That night, the doctor didn't sleep. He tested fragments himself, setting up slabs of pig flesh and firing captured German shrapnel rounds into them. Each shot sent sparks across the dark. When he placed the steel vest over the target, most fragments flattened against it. The ones that penetrated slowed enough to make the difference between life and death. He wrote it all down in neat, controlled handwriting. Velocity reduced. Fatality probability reduced by 60%. The next morning he brought his notes to the group commander. The colonel skimmed them, eyes narrowing. "You understand, Doctor, we can't authorize unsanctioned equipment. If every man on this base started redesigning his kit, we'd have chaos." "I'm not redesigning," Johnson said. "I'm preventing funerals." The colonel hesitated, the bureaucrat inside him warring with the soldier who'd seen too many telegrams sent home. Finally he said, "You tested on volunteers." "I didn't hear about it." "Understood?" That was all Johnson needed. Within days, 3 gunners volunteered. They weren't idealists. They were survivors who'd seen what flak did to their friends. Johnson fitted each vest by hand, checking every rivet, adjusting every strap. When they took off that morning, the sky was pale gray, a thin frost over the runway. Johnson watched until the last bomber vanished into cloud. Hours later, the rumble returned, then the sound of sirens. The formation limped home, engines coughing smoke, wings riddled with holes. But the 3 men wearing Johnson's armor walked into the infirmary grinning through soot. One had a dent across his chest plate the size of a coin. The fragment that should have killed him lay flattened inside the fabric. Johnson held it between his fingers, feeling the sharp edge that hadn't cut flesh. He said nothing, only nodded. The gunners told everyone who'd listen. By nightfall, 10 more crews were asking for vests. The flight surgeon's tiny, unauthorized experiment was spreading through the 8th Air Force like wildfire. He worked without rest, scavenging whatever metal he could find. Scrap fuselage skin, flak-damaged panels, even old mess hall trays. Mechanics joined in, shaping curves on makeshift anvils, hammering rhythmically as searchlights swept the sky. The sound echoed across the airfield, a strange new rhythm of defiance. The ring of steel against steel. Word eventually reached headquarters. A logistics officer arrived, clipboard in hand, to investigate the non-standard protective garments. Johnson met him at the infirmary door, his coat smudged with oil. The officer frowned at the cluttered table of half-finished armor. "You can't just invent equipment, Doctor. There's a process." "There's also a war," Johnson replied. "And it's killing my men faster than your process can save them." The man left with a stack of reports and an uneasy look. Johnson knew he'd just signed his own reprimand, maybe worse. But he didn't care. The vests were working. Every returning crew proved it. Each time a vest came back scarred but intact, he hung it on the infirmary wall like a trophy. By the 5th mission, the wall was full. What began as disobedience was becoming a legend. Crews traded whiskey for a chance at a vest. Even the pilots, who had thicker armor behind their seats, asked for versions that wrapped around the torso. Johnson couldn't keep up. He trained orderlies to cut and rivet. The hangar turned into a makeshift factory. The base commander tried to maintain plausible deniability. Officially, no one knew about the vests. Unofficially, he made sure shipments of scrap steel accidentally arrived at the medical tent. As weeks turned into months, the statistics changed. Fewer men died of chest wounds. More came back with bruises instead of holes. Johnson updated his charts quietly, but the pattern was impossible to miss. The vest had done what headquarters wouldn't, turned vulnerability into survival. Still, Johnson knew the hammer would fall eventually. Military bureaucracy tolerated miracles only when they came with the right paperwork. He could already feel the tension building. the same way the air felt before flak bursts lit up the sky. The hammer fell quietly, as it always did in the military. No shouts, no warning, just an envelope. One cold morning, Johnson found a typed notice on his desk. Cease all unsanctioned research and production immediately. No signature, only the seal of the medical corps. He sat staring at it while the generators hummed outside. The walls around him were lined with dented armor plates, each bearing its own wound. Holes, scratches, burn marks, silent proof that his work mattered. For a long time he didn't move. Then he folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket, like a man putting away bad news for later. That night he walked the runway again, coat collar turned up against the wind. Searchlights swung lazily through the mist. Somewhere above, another formation was crossing the channel. He could almost hear the engines droning overhead, the heavy rhythm of survival. Every beat of that sound reminded him why he had started. He wasn't chasing glory. He was trying to stop the bleeding. When the first bomber limped home hours later, the crew carried a gunner on a stretcher. Johnson knelt beside him. The man was conscious, breathing hard, the front of his vest crushed inward like a punched-in door. Johnson unfastened the straps and found the twisted fragment of flak embedded in the steel. The metal had caught it. The heart beneath was still beating. "Looks like it works," the gunner rasped with a grin. Johnson smiled back, weary but vindicated. "Yeah," he said, "it works." The next morning he sent the crushed plate, along with the spent fragment, to headquarters. Attached was a note written in his precise handwriting, "Recommend further study. Evidence attached. Authorization irrelevant." The reply came faster than expected. 2 men in clean uniforms arrived in a jeep, inspectors from London. They found Johnson in the hangar, surrounded by half-finished vests and grease-stained charts. One of them adjusted his cap and said, "Dr. Johnson, you've created quite a stir." "I hope it's the useful kind," Johnson answered. They examined everything: the steel composition, the stitching pattern, the data on impact velocity. They even brought their own samples of flak. At first they were skeptical, almost amused. Then Johnson placed one of his vests on a sandbag target and invited them to fire. The first shot rang out sharp and clear. When the smoke cleared, the inspector stepped forward, eyes widening. The steel was dented but intact. He ran his fingers over the crater, frowning in disbelief. "It stopped it," Johnson simply nodded. "You can write that in your report." By the end of the day, the tone had shifted. The inspectors' voices grew hushed, their questions more urgent. They photographed everything, took samples, even requested a demonstration at higher calibers. Johnson complied without satisfaction. He had been right all along, but vindication carried no joy, only the memory of the men who hadn't lived to see it. A week later, official orders arrived. His design, slightly modified and renamed, was to be tested across multiple bomber groups. The wording was careful. Experimental Protective Flak Vest, Type M1, developed under the supervision of Flight Surgeon Major Johnson. The word "unauthorized" had disappeared from the record. Production began at a factory near Birmingham. Within months, thousands of vests were shipped to airfields across England. Each carried a small stamped plate on the inside, property of the U.S. Army Air Forces. No mention of the doctor who had built the first one with scrap metal and stubbornness. Johnson didn't care about credit. What mattered were the numbers. By spring, casualty reports from bomber units began to shift. Chest and abdominal fatalities dropped by more than half. Surgeons who had spent months performing desperate thoracic surgeries suddenly found themselves treating bruises instead of holes. One afternoon, a crew returned from a mission over Berlin. Their ball turret gunner staggered out pale and shaking, clutching a piece of curved metal in both hands. "Flak hit me dead on," he said. "Would have torn me in two." The dent on the plate was deep enough to swallow a bullet. He kissed it like a relic and hung it in the mess hall. Word of the miracle spread fast. Newspapers back home ran headlines about a secret vest saving airmen's lives. Pilots called it the Johnson Armor, though officially it was still just a number on a supply list. Letters poured in from families, mothers, wives, brothers, thanking the unnamed surgeon whose idea had kept their sons alive. Johnson read a few, then tucked them away unread. The war still had work left for him. Even as recognition began to grow, another storm brewed behind the scenes. The procurement officers wanted to streamline production, replace steel with cheaper alloys, simplify the design. Johnson protested. "You change the density, you change the outcome," he warned. But the machine of war was already rolling. Numbers mattered more than nuance. One evening, sitting alone in the infirmary, he traced his finger along the wall of damaged vests. Each dent was a life reclaimed from the sky. He thought about the first prototype. Rough edges, hand-hammered curves, rivets borrowed from aircraft skin. It had looked ridiculous back then, but in every line of steel he could see the stubborn belief that a man's life was worth breaking the rules for. Outside, the wind carried the low growl of engines climbing into darkness again. Johnson stood at the door, watching the planes vanish into cloud. Somewhere out there, thousands of men were trusting their lives to a thing he had once been ordered to stop building. He smiled faintly, the expression of a man who had seen too much to celebrate. The war wasn't over, but something inside him had already found peace. The war in the air was supposed to be scientific, precision bombing, altitude, mathematics, efficiency. On paper it looked clean. In the real skies over Europe, it was chaos painted in smoke and fire. Each morning began the same, a thin gray dawn over English airfields, engines coughing to life, crews stumbling through fog with helmets slung low and nerves wound tight. They joked because silence was unbearable. Someone always said, "Back for dinner," and someone else always replied, "If the flak gods allow." Beneath the banter sat the same truth. Every mission was a coin toss. When the briefing maps unrolled across the wall, red string traced a line over France, Germany, or the Ruhr Valley. The target names changed, but the meaning never did. Another city ringed with guns. Crews memorized altitudes, approach headings, rally points. Then they stared at the chalkboard listing who wasn't coming back. Spaces filled faster than they emptied. At 25,000 feet, the air was thin and cruel. Frost crept across the inside of cockpits. Oxygen masks froze to faces. But the real enemy wasn't the cold. It was the unseen burst that could rip a man apart before he even heard it. Flak shells didn't discriminate. A hit could tear through an engine, a wing, or a human body with equal indifference. Veterans described it as flying through a storm made of metal. The first black puffs looked almost harmless, like soot. Then the shockwave slammed the fuselage, shaking bolts loose, spraying fragments the size of coins through the cabin. A single shard could slice through aluminum, skin, and bone in a heartbeat. When crews returned, medics saw the same wounds over and over: punctured lungs, shredded arteries, abdominal hits that left no chance. The steel around the pilots' seats offered some hope, but gunners and navigators were exposed from the waist up, sitting behind thin-skin panels designed for speed, not safety. The numbers told the story better than any speech. In 1943 alone, more than 50,000 airmen were listed as casualties in the 8th Air Force. On certain missions, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, 1 in every 3 planes failed to return. The men called it the aluminum lottery. Some prayed. Others stopped believing altogether. Between missions, the airfields looked calm, almost peaceful. You could see crews lounging beside their planes, smoking, writing letters. But if you looked closer, the calm was brittle. There was always someone scrubbing blood from the floor of a bomber, someone folding a flight jacket left behind, someone staring at an empty bunk. The surgeons worked in near silence. Their tents smelled of antiseptic, fuel, and fear. They learned to recognize the sound of trucks coming in from the runway. The slow grind of tires meant survivors. The fast rattle meant stretchers. When the canvas flaps opened, the light would catch on fragments of shrapnel still lodged in flesh. There wasn't time to ask names. Each operation was a race against blood loss. The men who came in alive often didn't stay that way. The fragments tore irregular paths through tissue. Standard field dressings couldn't stop the bleeding. Even when they succeeded, infection followed. The surgeons' hands never really stopped shaking. They just learned to shake afterward when no one was watching, and yet they went back. Every dawn, the same faces lined up for another mission. They knew the odds. They had seen the burnt planes returning, engines hanging by cables. But courage in those days wasn't loud. It was routine. You simply climbed the ladder, strapped in, and hoped the sky let you live. For Johnson, the quiet, meticulous flight surgeon, each casualty report was a personal failure. His job was to keep men alive, but medicine could do little against steel traveling faster than sound. He patched what he could, wrote the reports, and watched the stretchers roll away. Each time he washed his hands afterward, he saw the water turn red, then clear again, and wondered how long he could keep pretending it was enough. In the evenings, He walked the line of grounded bombers. Their fuselages were pocked with holes. You could stick a finger through some of them. In the evenings, he walked the line of grounded bombers. Their fuselages were pocked with holes. You could stick a finger through some of them. When the sunlight hit at the right angle, it looked like the planes were bleeding light. He thought about the men who had sat in those positions. How a few more inches of steel might have meant the difference. One night, while cleaning instruments under a single bulb, he paused over a tray filled with shrapnel fragments collected from wounds that day. They glimmered like dirty jewels. Jagged, twisted, each one carrying the weight of a man's death. He lined them up by size, from tiny splinters to pieces big enough to fill a hand. Most had torn through soft tissue. Very few had hit bone first. The pattern told him something obvious, but overlooked. The fragments lost most of their energy after penetrating even thin material. He picked up one of the larger pieces, turned it in the light, and whispered to no one, "If only there were something between them and this." Outside, the wind howled across the field, carrying with it the low thrum of distant engines returning from the night's raid. Johnson looked up, hand still holding the metal, and for the first time an idea began to take shape, faint, fragile, but stubborn. Nights on base were never truly dark. The glow from the maintenance hangars spread across the runways, a dull orange haze that mixed with the mist and oil fumes. Somewhere, a generator coughed, and men's voices drifted through the fog, low, tired, too thin to be laughter. When the engines finally fell silent, the quiet pressed down like a weight. That was when the thoughts came. Some airmen counted missions like prisoners marking days on a wall. 25 and you could go home. But few reached the number. They joked about it over mess hall stew. "Just 20 more, boys," as if joking could keep fate away. Underneath, every man knew that each new sortie shortened the odds. The veterans had a certain look, eyes hollowed by too many dawn briefings, faces pale from oxygen starvation. Their humor grew strange, brittle. They named their bombers Heavenly Body, Dead Man's Hand, No Reply. The names were bravado, charms against the inevitable. They wrote letters before takeoff and left them with the chaplain, never sure who would have to deliver them. Inside the infirmary, the toll wasn't measured in missions, but in moments. Johnson and his team lived by the rhythm of sirens. Each time they heard that rising wail, they dropped what they were doing and ran. Sometimes the stretchers carried men still cursing and grinning. Sometimes they carried silence. The surgeon learned to read the crews by sound alone. The shuffle of boots when there was hope. The slow scrape when there wasn't. He began keeping a small ledger, a personal record separate from the official reports. In it he noted the wound patterns: upper torso, left quadrant, fragment entry, chest cavity, fatal in 30 seconds. The entries blurred together until they felt like the same man dying again and again in different bodies. After a while he stopped writing names. Sleep became impossible. When he closed his eyes, he saw the inside of fuselages. The black holes punched through aluminum skin. Sometimes he dreamed of falling through those holes, watching the earth spin closer, knowing there would be no parachute strong enough. He would wake drenched in sweat, the sound of flak still echoing in his ears. The men talked about fear in practical terms. They called it the shakes or flak happy. Johnson knew the clinical term, combat fatigue, but words did little to help. Some gunners developed a twitch that never went away. Others stared blankly through meals, spooning food into their mouths without tasting. The bravest were not those who felt nothing, but those who felt everything and climbed back into the plane anyway. One evening, after another brutal mission, the surgeon walked through the wreckage line. Mechanics worked under floodlights, patching holes, replacing torn control surfaces. The smell of burned oil and cordite hung heavy. He stopped beside a B-17 that had limped home with half its tail missing. Inside he found a seat shredded by fragments, the fabric soaked dark. A name was stenciled on the headrest: Henderson. Johnson remembered operating on him the night before. The young man hadn't made it through the morning. He stood there for a long time, tracing the jagged edges of the hole in the fuselage. The metal had folded inward, sharp as a blade. He imagined the path the fragment had taken, from sky to steel to flesh. The math of death was brutally simple: velocity, thickness, distance. If any variable changed, the outcome changed. Later, back in the infirmary, he laid out pieces of recovered flak on a sterile tray. They were small things, unremarkable outside of context, shards no bigger than a thumb, curved and blackened. Yet each one carried the story of a man who had bled out under his hands. He arranged them by size again, a grim habit, then covered them with gauze as if tucking them to sleep. The official briefing spoke in numbers. 8 aircraft lost, 32 men missing. Johnson had stopped hearing numbers. He heard individual voices: the navigator who played harmonica after dinner, the radio operator who sketched cartoons on the walls, the pilot who promised his fiancée he'd bring home a piece of the Eiffel Tower. Every loss was a subtraction from the fragile community that held the base together. The days blurred. Missions went out. Wrecks came back. The surgeon's hands grew steadier, not because he was calmer, but because he no longer had the luxury of shaking. In his rare quiet moments, he found himself staring at the curved metal bowls used to hold surgical instruments. Their shine reminded him of the bomber's skin, both thin, both reflective, both fragile. One afternoon, a young medic approached him, holding a flak fragment wrapped in gauze. "Sir, this one stopped halfway through the man's vest lining," he said. The fragment was smaller than usual, blunted at the edge. Johnson turned it over, thoughtful. "Halfway," he murmured. "So the fabric slowed it." The medic nodded, not understanding what gears he had just set turning. That evening, Johnson pulled out one of the shredded uniforms kept for disposal. He laid the torn fabric flat on the table, placed the fragment on it, and pressed with his thumb. The edge caught, but didn't cut through immediately. Something in the weave resisted. He fetched a piece of thin metal from a damaged engine cowl and set it beneath the cloth. Together they formed a rough barrier, light, flexible, imperfect, but stronger than either alone. He stared at the improvised layer for a long time. The thought that had been growing in the back of his mind finally solidified into a single rebellious idea. If this much protection came from scraps, what if we built something meant to stop the fragments entirely? For the first time in months, Johnson felt the faint spark of purpose. It was reckless, perhaps even insubordinate, but he didn't care. The men outside deserved a chance that medicine alone could not give them. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, announcing another group returning from the dark. Johnson didn't move toward the door. Instead, he picked up the fragment, weighed it in his palm, and whispered the thought aloud, as if saying it might make it real. "We can build something better." Morning broke with the dull, metallic light that always seemed to hang over the English countryside. Rain drizzled across the runways, streaking the bomber wings with silver lines. Johnson stood beneath the awning of the infirmary, his hands deep in his coat pockets, watching the crews prepare for another mission. He wasn't looking at the planes themselves, but at the men climbing into them, the way they moved, the way their shoulders hunched as if bracing against something unseen. He turned back inside and shut the door. The smell of antiseptic hit him like memory. On the table lay the piece of thin engine metal he'd salvaged the night before, now wiped clean. He set it beside the scrap of cloth and the dull flak fragment. It didn't look like much, but in that small assembly of metal and fabric was the seed of an idea that could change everything. He began by cutting, layering, experimenting. There were no instructions, no blueprints, just instinct and stubborn logic. He tried doubling the cloth, then sandwiching metal between fabric. He took a scalpel and dropped fragments on the surface, listening to the clink of steel on steel. Each sound was a question. Would this be enough to stop death? In the corner of the room stood an old, battered X-ray table. Johnson dragged it over, bolted the pieces together on its flat surface, and covered it with gauze. When the first batch of wounded came in that morning, he treated them as usual, but his eyes kept flicking toward the table, toward the fragments he'd arranged like chess pieces in a game against mortality. By evening, he'd convinced a mechanic friend to let him test the material in the hangar after dark. They rigged up a makeshift target, canvas stretched tight over sandbags. Johnson attached his layered panel to the front, stepped back, and nodded for the mechanic to fire a single round from a captured MG-15. The shot cracked through the hangar. When they examined the panel, the bullet had punched clean through both layers. Johnson stared at the hole, silent. The mechanic started to apologize, but he shook his head. "No, it's good," he said quietly. "Now we know what doesn't work." He spent the next week experimenting in secret. Every night he scavenged metal from the junk pile. Engine cowling, mess trays, fragments of downed planes. He tested each piece, recording notes in the same neat handwriting he used for medical reports. Thickness, 1.2 mm penetration, complete. Failure. Then again. Thickness, 2 mm fragment decelerated. Partial success. It became an obsession. His hands blistered from cutting steel. His uniform sleeves were streaked with oil. During the day, he still performed surgeries, still signed the death certificates. But at night, he forged and tested again and again, chasing a design that existed only in his imagination. Word began to spread quietly among the crews. Some joked that the doc was building armor for angels. Others weren't joking. They stopped by the infirmary under pretense of checkups, glancing at the strange curved plates on the workbench. One gunner asked, "You think it'd work up there?" Johnson didn't answer right away. He looked at the man's hands, calloused, shaking slightly from adrenaline, and said, "If I can make it lighter." There were failures. Plenty of them. Plates that cracked, layers that delaminated under stress. Once a test piece shattered completely, sending shards flying across the hangar. One caught Johnson across the cheek, leaving a thin scar. He wiped the blood away and made another note. Edge fracture under impact. Material too brittle. Try softer steel. He began to think in equations: density, velocity, angle of impact. But what drove him wasn't math. It was memory. Every time a fragment failed to stop, he saw another face lost. Each success meant someone might live. One midnight test changed everything. He'd switched to a new alloy, salvaged from an engine mount, hard but flexible. He cut the plates into curved sections, fitted them into a rough harness made from old parachute webbing, and fired again. The bullet hit, dented and stopped. Johnson ran his fingers over the crater. The metal was warm to the touch, but intact. He couldn't help it. He laughed, the sound harsh and disbelieving. "That's it," he whispered. "That's it." He repeated the test 3 more times. Each round dented the plate but failed to pierce it. The mechanic who'd been helping him just stared, jaw slack. "Doc," he said, "if that thing really works—" "It's going to," Johnson replied. "And nobody up there needs to die the way they've been dying." The next step was riskier. He needed to prove the concept under real conditions. He fashioned a crude vest. 3 steel plates sewn into canvas, covering chest and abdomen. He didn't trust anyone else to try it first, so he strapped it on himself. The mechanic hesitated. "You sure about this?" Johnson's voice was steady. "If I'm wrong, I'd rather find out here than at 20,000 feet. The first shot slammed into the plate with a metallic crack that echoed through the hangar. The force knocked him backward into a crate. For a moment he couldn't breathe. Then he stood up, coughing, pulling the vest open. The bullet had flattened against the metal. His ribs ached, but there was no blood. He looked down at the dent, the smoking barrel, the mechanic's pale face, and grinned through the pain. "Now," he said, "we're getting somewhere." That night, as the rain hammered against the roof, Johnson sat alone in his quarters, staring at the dented vest lying across the table. His chest still throbbed from the impact, but it didn't matter. For the first time since the war began, he felt like he was fighting back on his own terms. He opened his notebook and wrote a single line at the bottom of the page. Objective: protection of human life through mechanical resistance. Then, under it smaller, authorization, none required. Outside, the sky flashed with distant lightning, echoing the thunder of bombers departing for another mission. Johnson watched the lights fade into the clouds and whispered, "Hold on, boys. I'm working on it."